Hi, everybody. It's topic 5 of Unit 1. Today we're talking about the Cold War in the UN. And I know we're quite a distance away from the Cold War now, but even though this is an event that's rooted in the past, it has a lot of themes in it that are relevant today. In particular, the way that blocs and alliances and political ideologies and stuff can shape the conversation there that might change the way you would think that sovereignty over benefits exchanges would go. So the Cold War in the UN, it really is a story of the UN from its founding in 1945 until the end of the Cold War around 1990. There's some parts that end a little bit sooner. There's some stuff that ends a little bit later. But by and large, you're talking about 45 years worth of the history of the United Nations, which is now almost 75 years old. So we're going to look at this and get through the way the United States and the Soviet Union and their allies approached each other at the UN, and then what role China played as well. So they start as allies of a sort, right? I mean, you understand that from past lectures already that it was the conversations between all the states in the world, but particularly the great powers, the three main allies, the UK, the US, and the USSR, talking about the desire to have a UN. And they set up that structure whereby those allies retain power. There was no real disagreement. There was nobody who said, yeah, it should be these states, but not the USSR. The one caveat to that is you could see by the insistence of the United States and the United Kingdom that France be given one of the privileged positions at the UN, that there's an attempt to outweigh the Soviets on the council in terms of the ideologies that might be presented. There's another reason why they went France, and that's because it's going to have a major role to play with decolonization and with its influence around the world. But allies of a sort is where we're going to start, the United States and the USSR. But it doesn't take very long before that shifts. So there's a quick division. So down, I want to start at the bottom of this slide, really, where it has Europe in quotes, and then Western Europe and Eastern Europe. You will recall from the last lecture that we looked at the evolving nature of states, what regions they belong to, as different states became independent at different times. So a lot of the bodies of the UN have subsets of the whole UN in it. We'll look at this more in Unit 2. But if you take, for example, the General Assembly and its related committees, all countries in the world are there. All of them have an equal vote. But if you go to almost any other organization, as long as they're not meeting in plenary, so usually when they meet in plenary, it means it's a body of the whole. But usually there's a representative group of states sitting there at the UN. And the states, like who gets to be there, is typically divided up geographically. So you would say Europe gets this many spots, the Americas gets this many spots, Africa, etc. Very, very early on in 1945 and 46, the Soviets insisted that Europe be split into two. Now, that's interesting because we don't have, for example, an East Africa and a West Africa, or a North Asia and a South Asia. It's Asia, it's Africa, it's the Americas, and then it's West Europe and Eastern Europe. And they believed that if you elected someone from Eastern Europe, from Western Europe, they couldn't be expected to represent the viewpoints of the Eastern Europe states that were part of the Warsaw Pact. So the Warsaw Pact is really that key idea. So the Warsaw Pact are the allied states to the USSR. They're communist in orientation. And the USA and NATO sitting on the other side. So you couldn't elect a NATO state, even though NATO's not a region at the UN, a NATO state, and have it represent the Warsaw Pact states, or so went the thinking. So there's a quick division, an insistence that one of the first steps of the Cold War be to divide out different parts of Europe. Okay, well, that's one question that flummoxes them right away. This idea that there's going to be some unanimity or unity of purpose, it goes away awfully quickly right after the war. I mean, you're sort of together planning the post-war world, knowing you'll have differences, but understanding that you've just found commonality and that maybe that would prevail. All peace-loving states after all, and it doesn't. The territorial question is one that's a little bit more complicated. So when we looked at the evolution of the states last time, I didn't really talk about, to reemphasize what's in the charter, it was how one becomes a state. So becoming a new state requires you to have the support of the Security Council. So support of the Security Council would entail a 2/3 majority vote or better, and none of the powers in the Security Council vetoing it, the 5 powers. And then you need a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly to also vote for you. So it's a little bit complicated because there are areas of the world that could get one but not the other, and they're blocked from becoming a state. For example, it would not be hard for Palestine today to get 2/3 of the General Assembly to support its candidacy as a country, but the United States would veto it in the Security Council because of its alliance with Israel. Unless Israel says, yes, we favor the creation of this Palestinian state, the US would vote no. So Palestine can't get both. Whereas other states might be able to get through the Security Council but couldn't get through the 2/3. Anyway, so typically what that process was parts of a country breaking off into a new country. And when the Chinese Revolution happened in the late 1940s, in 1949, it really presented an interesting challenge because, as you know, China had a permanent seat on the Security Council, has a permanent seat on the Security Council. Officially, the Chinese government was registered with the UN as the Republic of China. The forces of Chiang Kai-shek and the Republic of China fought the revolution against the forces of Mao Zedong and what became the People's Republic of China. And when the PRC wins, this big entity of China, the Republic of China leadership and peoples were pushed out to the island of Taiwan. You don't have to worry about Hong Kong and Macau in here for our purposes today. So this becomes the Republic of China. This is the People's Republic of China. The PRC says that they're China, and the Taiwanese say that they're China. Neither one of them say we're a new entity called something else and we'd like to be independent and a member of the UN. They both aspire to be Chinese and to have the spot at the UN. And because it was the ROC that was ensconced at the UN, and because the ROC continues to exist, the PRC does not become the inheritor state, like we talked about before. The Taiwanese geographical region is China at the UN for all intents and purposes. They are the recognized one. So this big giant thing doesn't have a veto power or a voice at the UN. This little one did until 1971. In 1971, this shows a moment where the recognition shifted from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China, and the relationship is flipped. Now, this entity does not have representation at the UN or veto on the Security Council in any way, but the big entity does. But that played a very interesting role in the Cold War because communist China and capitalist Taiwan acted very differently. And this essentially, the presence of Taiwan on the council, the Republic of China on the council, which is Taiwan, geographically Taiwan, they're the ones then that wield the veto, and they're essentially allies of the United States. So that Security Council in the Cold War was frequently stacked with, in terms of the permanent 5, was stacked with pro-Western capitalist-leaning governments. And that meant that the Soviets had a real interest in trying to do this, right? To make sure there's an Eastern Europe so that they're not isolated on the Security Council, but some of their allies are there as well. It leads to the emergence of something, this conflict between the two, the emergence of something called the non-aligned movement. So let's go back to that slide again here. So in this banner across the top, I have the first world written and the second world written. You've probably heard of the phrase third world to refer to poorer developing countries. The origin of the phrase refers back to the Cold War era polarization between pro-US allied states and pro-USSR allied states as a first world and a second world. And when the non-aligned movement emerged, they proposed themselves as a third world, a non-aligned world, even though lots of them were aligned. For example, the Cubans after 1959, they're a client state of the Soviet Union. So they weren't really non-aligned, but they had a definite stake in the system. But on some things, they went it their own way, different than what the Soviets wanted. So they were the third world. They emerged and they pledged to do these things vis-a-vis each other. So what this is an IGO, the non-aligned movement. It still exists. it had an agreement, a charter, that sets out these 5 principles as to what they do, but it's non-binding, which means that if they want to go against each other, either in a war or in a trade conflict or something, they don't have to stick closely to this with any consequences because it was a non-binding act. What they're really interested in is this number one, the mutual respect for territory and sovereignty. They promise not to get up in each other's business. That doesn't really work out either. But there's now 121 of these states, or 120 in the non-aligned movement, and it's a product of the Cold War and a very important block of allies that sort of uh, supersedes the regional bloc that we've talked about this far. But let's come back to the heart of the matter in, oops, sorry about that, heart of the matter in the UN during the Cold War, and that is what the Sovereignty over Benefits Exchange really came down to in the Cold War. So there's a funding mechanism that we'll look at again several times this semester, whereby each member state pays a share of the UN budget proportional to their share of the global economy. What it means in the modern era is that a lot of countries pay almost nothing to be part of the United Nations. 120 or so combined make up about 1% or 1.25% of the entire budget. The United States today pays 22% of the budget. And in the post-war era, we had an even larger share of the global economy. We paid sometimes in the 40 percentile range, in the 30s and now 22, for the operations of the organization. So what that means is you're giving individual countries money from their taxpayers to the organization to do work on behalf of the global community. Now, some of this goes right along with what our interests are, but in a situation where you have the ability for the Soviets, for example, to veto something we're interested in the Security Council, or for all the states in the world to vote in the General Assembly or the Economic and Social Council or in a host of other locations, they can vote to do things with our money that does not please us. And that question of sovereignty over benefits becomes one that bothers people in the United States quite a lot in the Cold War. So I've listed a whole bunch of things here that generated controversy during the Cold War because some of what we would have wanted doesn't play out because it's not what the majority wants, or at least the voting majority wants through Cold War conflicts. For example, agricultural development is very different in the United States as opposed to the Soviet Union, where it's collectivized. There's a whole portion of the world where still they use collectivized agricultural approaches, where the states plan centrally what each farmer will do and what they will contribute and what the crop will be and when it will be harvested and all those things. Whereas we wanted to promote a much different model of agriculture that looks more like what the American West and East looks like in terms of individual dairy farms or corporations or others working together. We don't want the staff of the Secretariat, which we'll look at next time, to be, which the staff, the professional salaries are going to be paid largely from our tax dollars. We don't want that to be full of communists promoting their ideology, perhaps. We don't want human rights to be minimized. We don't want education, for example, to be indoctrination. And you get to some very interesting arguments in things like culture and science and technology that are supposed to be promoted through different organizations that become hugely controversial because of our money going to fund programs that could be directed by people with very different ideologies than us. So these are concerns. It's a major, major question. I'm going to have you watch one of the bonus bits is from the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had a whole week and a half worth of debates and discussions at the Security Council where the Soviets insisted they were doing nothing wrong, and we insisted they were doing something wrong. And it's a dramatic moment where the U.S. Produced proof in the Security Council, and it really gave us a big boost in terms of international credibility to have the forum of the Security Council. So here we go now to the end of this topic. The UN was really important. So when you're talking about the Cold War, there's all kinds of avenues where this is fought. In my sports and international affairs class, we look at and emphasize sporting conflict. If you had a culture class, a science class, almost any kind of class. Diplomacy, the conflict is there. And at the United Nations, it was no difference where they struggled for supremacy in the Cold War and the UN.